So the fourth of the works that we'll explore in the first week of the class is The Emperor of Ice Cream. And while you may have thought that Bullet in the Brain was a little easier than some of the things we read prior to this, you may have found Emperor of Ice Cream to be much more difficult. In fact, past classes have told me that they think this is, in a lot of ways, one of the harder things they've had to read in this class, period. So it is a difficult poem, but I did choose it because I think in a lot of ways it's an interesting comparison to go along with Bullet in the Brain. Both of them juxtapose life, aesthetic experience, vibrancy with a kind of notion of the world as merely the sum of its material parts, right? And that contrast, I think, is interesting and something that both writers play with in a lot of ways. So let's start with a little background on Wallace Stevens in the poem. Stevens himself was probably a better contemporary with Frost or Hemingway than he is with Tobias Wolff. He once again is associated with the modernist period of American literature and those kinds of themes and issues. Unlike Hemingway or Frost, though, he didn't have what you'd call a typical writer background, whereas Hemingway was this globe-trotting adventurer and Frost was this sort of guy living in the woods in New England in a cozy poet's life. Wallace Stevens was an insurance executive, something we don't normally associate with literature. And somehow with this day job, he still found time to write poetry in his spare time and become one of the great poets of the 20th century. The Emperor of Ice Cream is one of his better known poems. And as I said, it's kind of difficult in a lot of ways. You might have been completely lost as you read through it the first time. But the context here helps a lot. Stevens references that this is actually a poem describing a funeral in New Orleans. I don't know how much you know about New Orleans funerals, but they're sort of big parties or to-dos. They're more kind of in the spirit of Irish wakes rather than your sedate or mournful typical funeral. The one here that he's describing is a scene on the street outside of a funeral where the mourners are actually dancing and making ice cream, right? So he writes a poem where he contrasts that kind of scene with a more sedate vision of death of the actual corpse inside the home, right? So the poem is broken into two stanzas. In the first, Wallace describes the vibrant scene outside. In the second, he is focusing on the corpse itself inside. Even with this description, though, I think there are some things in the text that are kind of difficult. So let's look at the stanzas. So the first stanza, call the roller of big cigars, the muscular one, and bid him whip in kitchen cups concupiscent curds. Let the wenches dawdle in such dress as they are used to wear, and let the boys bring flowers and last month's newspapers. Let B be finale of scene. The only emperor is the Emperor of Ice Cream. So once again, this is the scene outside the funeral. There's this weird kind of authoritative voice that is describing the whole scene. Stevens himself said the speaker of the poem is a kind of rancid persona. I think what he means by that is the guy is kind of rude and dismissive of the world. So when he describes this sort of vibrant scene, he's going to do so in ways that are diminishing in its description of the scene itself, right? The wenches are dawdling in such dress as they are used to wear. The boys are bringing flowers and last month's newspapers. So the speaker is trying to describe the funeral in less than flattering terms, at least from his perspective, right? These things may have different connotations for us as readers than they do for the speaker. A few other things, too, you should note. Curds here is just reference to dairy products. So when the muscular roller of cigars is churning up concupiscent curds, it's just a description of ice cream. Concupiscent here means lusty, and a lot of people have suggested it has a kind of sexual connotation, with the implication being that ice cream is a kind of lusty sort of dairy product. People lust for ice cream, if you will. That may sound silly, but think about ice cream as being kind of an absolute good in some ways, right? And if you know anything about old-timey ice cream makers, there are these hand crank jobs that are really difficult to keep cranking again and again. And as you go toward the end of the ice cream making process, it gets kind of hard. So the guy who does this has to be a really muscular, strong person, right? So what is all this first stanza coming to? The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. But I think one of the things he's getting at here is the person who brings pleasure, the person who creates the ice cream, is kind of the person who is in charge, right? So referencing back to the emperor of ice cream, it's these sorts of pleasures that are the things that kind of run life. These are the things that we make most out of. The other thing I think is significant in this first stanza is this very famous line here, let be finale of seem. It's hard to understand exactly, again, what Stevens is getting at. But I think what he's saying is here, he's saying, let things that are be merely the end of what things seem to be. So let be, or is, what exists, be the finale of what seems to be, right? And the idea is that what is only the things that seem to be existing are things that exist. The world is only exactly as we see it all around us right now. Life is merely like the product of our sensations. There's no philosophy or art or anything else that'll give it more meaning. I think Stevens has said that the speaker of the poem is not necessarily something he's agreeing with, but a view of the world that was typical, at least he thought, in the time he's writing. And once again, it's sort of expression of the alienation that we think of when we think of modernist writing, right? So let be finale of seem. And in that kind of world, then, the only person with significance is the person who gives you ice cream, the kind of cold, easy, lusty pleasure, right? So this is a kind of scene of life in the face of death, which is interesting. And then we move to the second stanza where we no longer can avoid death at all. And we've moved inside to the corpse itself. Take from the dresser of deal, and here this is just a sort of cheap wooden dresser lacking the 3 glass knobs, that sheet on which she embroidered fantails once and spread it so as to cover her face. If her horny feet protrude, they come to show how cold she is and dumb. Let the lamp affix its beam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. So let's just go through some of the harder words in the second stanza too. First of all, dumb, to show how cold she is and dumb. Dumb here means mute, right? The idea is the corpses don't talk. On the one hand, this is kind of obvious. We don't speak when we're dead, but it does kind of reemphasize the idea of the corpse being merely just a corpse, not a spirit or sort of a memory of a person, but just a cold kind of dead thing. And cold here is interesting word choice. In one sense, it sort of harkens back or compares to the first stanza because the first stanza is about ice cream after all. But here, cold has a very different connotation. So that one of the things the poem does is take earlier images and kind of recast them in a new way of looking at them to change our perspective about how we feel from them. So as we move from outside to the vibrant sort of funeral in the face of death, we move inside to the cold reality of death. And the same kinds of impressions or images take on new ideas here. And so we see some other images that sort of explain who this person was once, someone who was interested in embroidery, and then all these things now that were aspects of her life merely are now used to be reflections on how dead she is. The sheet that was once something that she worked on is now just the cover for her dead face. And so we are looking at a corpse that is very much dead. And he keeps reminding us how dead, dead, dead she is. Her horny feet here, it's not a kind of noble look at a body. Rather, it is they're old person's feet that have like corns or calluses on them. And again, they are a reflection of her mortality because They show the wear that a human body takes rather than showing sort of the elegance of human form. And then the light at the end, the conclusion of the poem, shows us this reality, the reality of the dead corpse, that is in some ways a kind of end of life, right? And we repeat once again this phrase, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. And in the first stanza, that might have been a kind of cause for solace or comfort. Ice cream is comfort in a difficult time. Here, it is more an expression that the end of all things is merely death, and that death, at least from the perspective of the speaker, not necessarily Stevens's, but from the perspective of the speaker, is just sort of a mute corpse that can't say anything more at all. So when we say let be finale of seem, things seem pretty dead in the second stanza. So that the reality of existence is kind of a mute ending. So in some ways, then, we have the first stanza as a comparison to the second stanza. And as I said, I think one of the things that's going on in this poem is a kind of comparison of the vibrancy of life to the finality of death. And in that way, it does offer a nice contrast to what is going on in the Tobias Wolff story, Bullet in the Brain. That is, I think, enough for now for you to get your thought process going on these stories, and we will go into them further as we move forward. All right, thank you.